Well, it's 2022, and people are still talking about Days Gone. Since the game came out around 3 years ago, it's been a bit divisive, as mainstream critics were largely lukewarm on it at release. Yet, it also has managed to carve out quite a fanbase for itself over the years. And according to Days Gone director Jeff Ross, who seems to have no shortage of complaints about how the game was treated by management since he and Sony Ben parted ways, the game sold pretty well too. In fact, it showed similar sales numbers to Ghost of Tsushima. Again, this is just according to Jeff Ross, the clearly at least somewhat disgruntled former employee of Ben Studio. Official sales numbers for Days Gone specifically have not been released as of yet, at least not anywhere that I can find them. As a longtime PlayStation guy, I have a lot of respect for Sony Ben. They brought us the excellent Siphon Filter games, Uncharted Golden Abyss, Bubsy 3D, and Resistance Retribution, so they have certainly had far more hits than misses, and pulled their weight in the PlayStation ecosystem for a long time. Then, in 2019, they put out Days Gone, a straight-up open-world zombie game at a time when that formula had already been done about 100 different ways, and the genre had been made fun of for years for being so oversaturated. Leading up to its launch, despite the game looking like it was coming along well, the team and the marketing were never really able to make a compelling argument for why it should exist.
E3 2016 saw the reveal of the game, and they said, oh, open world zombies, I've been there, I've done that plenty, moving on. Do you have a message for those people, or how do you rope in that audience?
Excellent question. So zombie fatigue is something that we've dealt with from the very beginning. And, honestly, I didn't think it was going to be a big issue. And then it turned out to be one, because I was like, well, these aren't zombies, they're freakers. I thought I said that.
Since then, fans of the game were irritated to learn that a Days Gone sequel was pitched, but turned down. Jeff reasonably seems to assume, based on some interviews I've seen him in recently, that it was that initial critical reception and the sluggish start to sales that ultimately led to that decision. And maybe he's right, but I'll dig into that a little bit later. For now, I want to review the game in its current state in 2022 and give my thoughts, because I think it's important to not just follow the current drama around devs that worked on the game, but to understand what this game is and why it's such an interesting title in the context of PlayStation Studios and gaming as a whole. And fair warning, I will be spoiling the hell out of a lot of the main story beats here, so if that's important to you, maybe skip ahead. Days Gone makes no excuse for being a pretty straight-up game with little in the way of frills or extravagancies. This is something I actually ended up liking about it, as I don't think every game needs to blow everything around it out of the water or have some kind of super innovative hook in order to be worth making and playing. It's an action-adventure open-world zombie game. Nothing inherently wrong with that. But in the context of PS4-era PlayStation, it does kind of seem like an odd way to spend years of development time when PlayStation already has a hyper-successful post-apocalyptic zombie franchise with a focus on crafting, shooting, and story. Upon closer inspection, the differences between The Last of Us and Days Gone are numerous. The Last of Us has explorable sandboxy areas, but it's largely linear, while Days Gone is more traditional open world. The Last of Us is also more intimate. Every single enemy you fight is highly dangerous, and each kill is borderline traumatizing. While Days Gone will eventually have you heartlessly blowing up literal hordes of freakers at once with the press of a button. So ultimately they are very different functionally and in tone. But aesthetically, on the surface, they look similar. Deacon, in particular, kind of looks a lot like Joel. He carries himself in a similar way and has a similar personality, sort of a Midwestern working-class loner dude who knows his way around guns, keeps his feelings to himself, always maintains some amount of facial hair, etc. They both even have a female that they lost at the center of their motivation. With Joel, it's a daughter who died, and with Deacon, it's a wife who's missing. But they both basically serve the same purpose, of being the primary driver of the main character's worldview, and they're both even named Sarah. That's kind of tone-deaf and bizarre, but more importantly, despite how similar Deacon is to Joel, he's not nearly as endearing a character as him, so he ends up feeling like low-rent Joel to me. Thank God for the motorcycle stuff, that does set him apart a little bit. Ultimately, I don't really think it's fair to compare Days Gone to The Last of Us as an overall package, but the way they crafted the aesthetic of Days Gone, and Deacon's character in particular, makes it hard not to. And I wouldn't blame somebody who doesn't know any better from seeing both games and just choosing to play The Last of Us because they've heard more about it. Days Gone should ultimately be viewed on its own merits though, and the story, on its own merits, isn't what I would call particularly remarkable. It's certainly not bad though. Deacon is searching for his wife, who he sent away to safety a ways back, and didn't go with her so he could help his friend Boozer. It's a solid setup, and it works for what it is. Deacon's motivation is to track down his wife, but as leads go cold, doubt occasionally creeps in as to whether or not she's even alive, let alone if he'll ever find her. Deacon won't leave any stone unturned though, and ends up finding a government Nero dude with some useful info, who himself is a nice little nod to Siphon Filter. And that is when he finally starts making ground on the search. I like the overall way this portion of the story was handled. It genuinely takes you back and forth, from thinking you're on the brink of a major discovery, to almost losing hope, and everything in between. If you follow it closely, you'll often be asking yourself, is Sarah about to be found? Is Deacon just wasting his time? Is this Nero dude even worth trusting? It's all really good in my opinion. I also rather liked Boozer. Compared to Deacon, he's a triumph of character development. I'll stop short of saying that the game should have been about him or something like that, but he does kind of outshine Deacon, you gotta admit. Now, some individual moments in the story didn't work for me. Most of the Nero checkpoint recordings are painfully redundant and add almost nothing to the lore. A group of scientists discover something crazy in their research and they scream as they're all killed by freakers and the recording ends. We get it. You didn't have to do that 30 times. Once was enough. And some of the flashbacks with Sarah completely fall apart, with some truly just baffling writing.
Here, you can have this one back. But only if you promise to ride me as much as you ride your bike.
But the overall thrust of the narrative, with Boozer and Deacon trying to find Sarah and often disagreeing on how much hope they should have, is an entertaining one that I felt invested in most of the time. But that's up until they actually find her. After what feels like about 75% of the game or so, they do find Sarah. And she's apparently been working her way up the ranks in a military base this entire time, and when they are reunited, she's just kind of shitty to him. I really felt like this was massively anticlimactic and just weird, and betrayed all of the momentum that the story spent the last 20 hours building. They do justify her attitude a bit, as she's really serious about her new role in life and all that, but God, the way the reunion plays out is just disheartening. They do eventually get back on track as a couple, which is nice to see, but then most of that is just shoved to the side, while the remaining quarter or so of the story focuses on the conflict between these two different camps. Iron Mike and his camp weren't particularly important to Deacon before, as he pretty much just used them like he used everybody else, as a means to his own ends. But now that Iron Mike is killed, suddenly he and Boozer are gonna lay it all on the line for them and organize a massive attack on the bad guys. And for a moment, it almost seems like Deacon is starting to turn into a character that cares about more than just himself and Sarah. It almost works, but they don't really give it enough time to build like they did the whole search for Sarah thing, so it just kind of makes this final act of the story feel kind of unfocused and meandering, at least to me. But at the end of the day, Sarah is saved, the Colonel is dead, Wizard Island falls, Boozer makes it out alive, and everyone pretty much just lives happily ever after, I guess. Despite the somewhat uninspired setting and the preposterously derivative main character and some wonky writing, the story overall feels like it was executed about as well as it could have been, considering the writing that the actors and designers were given to work with. But to be honest, it was the story's drawbacks that turned me off to Days Gone at first. I put the game down for quite a while after it was released because I just didn't like Deacon or Sarah, and despite my best efforts, I just couldn't get myself to really care much about what was going on. On top of that, I think the gameplay of the first few hours is a bit of a slog, as you really don't have anywhere near enough capacities for different resources and ammunitions to deal with just about any situation, and it took a lot more grinding to get there than I was interested in doing at the time. But that was then, and this is now.
One more.
For whatever reason, at one point last year, I decided to give the game another chance and looked at it in a different way. While the core gameplay loops of Days Gone take a while to find a good rhythm, once they do, they don't stop. Once you earn enough trust from some of the camps, you get access to way better weapons, way better motorcycle parts, and way more ammo capacity. After finding a dozen or so of the injectors, you can get your max health and stamina up to an acceptable level 2, enabling you to really maneuver around the hordes and more powerful enemies much more effectively. So while the grind is a bit daunting at first, the rewards for getting over that hill are immense and totally changed the game for me. I also had the privilege of returning to the game a year and a half after it launched, when most of the bugs were patched out, and I played it on my PS5, where it runs at a dynamic 4K and a rock-solid 60 frames per second. So all of that really helps a lot too. Wiping out nests, clearing away encampments, and taking on enemy hordes ended up being a lot of fun. Further in, more powerful enemies are introduced like breakers and reachers, who can take entire LMG magazines before going down. Infected bears who will gladly absorb multiple shotgun blasts to the dome unfazed, and of course the larger and larger hordes that will absolutely send chills up your spine when you see them in the distance. The game is so full of these things that once I was mostly done with the story and properly equipped to face them, I couldn't get enough of them. In fact, I got so addicted to it that I ended up dumping close to 100 hours into the game and platinuming it, which are 2 milestones I rarely reach with any game. One of the most ingenious things about Days Gone is not just its various systems being fun, but also how they can affect each other and unfold in different ways as you approach them differently. Planting bombs on stacks of lumber to unleash an avalanche of wooden death, or even luring the hordes into enemy camps and watching the chaos unfold from a safe distance. And maybe with a sniper rifle.
That was the last of them. Oh my.
The combat itself, of course, isn't anything revolutionary, but it is visceral enough to stay fun well after the credits roll, especially given the variety of melee weapons, crossbow bolts, and different heavy weaponry that you eventually get access to. Stealth is an option in most situations, but as usual for me, I just ended up getting spotted halfway through most encounters and just blasting my way through the rest of the enemy camp or whatever situation I was in. I also like that you can craft different versions of certain melee weapons on the fly, and that helps keep things interesting as well as prolong the life of whatever weapon you have. I became quite a fan of the buzzsaw blade baseball bat combo myself. Also, despite not caring much about the characters in them, stopping at the camps to restock and turn in my bounties always felt like a nice, much-needed chance to breathe and decompress. And I even sometimes enjoyed hanging around in them and stumbling across some rather entertaining little scenes. Once I started playing for the gameplay, looking forward to the next fight, uncovering more Nero injectors, tinkering with the bike, tracking down the next horde, Days Gone had not only recovered from feeling borderline mediocre, but it quickly became one of my favorite games from the last generation. Because of these gameplay systems and how they eventually evolved, I came to appreciate the world so much more. No matter what comes next from Sony Bend, I'll always have fond memories of randomly getting off my bike just to bash a few freakers' faces in with a sledgehammer before getting back on the road, just because I could. The graphics and presentation are largely on par with other first-party PlayStation exclusives of the time. Horizon Zero Dawn and God of War probably use your television's color palette a little better, but Days Gone is absolutely a beautiful game, with plenty of visual variety and gorgeous vistas that contrast nicely with the unspeakable horrors you'll be crossing paths with. Freakers are designed well, with tattered clothes and appropriately disturbing appearances. While I think the better-looking enemies are mostly held back in the latter half of the game, I wouldn't say anything looks forgettable or lazy in the slightest. The music also works well. The pulsating rumbles that accompany the horde battles ratchet up the tension really well. And the Western-style ballady music that comes in during long motorcycle rides brings out the flavor of the game in a way that only a good soundtrack can. On top of New Game Plus, the devs have added various challenge modes that pit you against endless hordes, make you wipe out enemy camps within time limits, and even a pretty fun Crazy Taxi-style mode where you pick up characters in the game and drop them off at different spots in a golf cart. Genius. You can also play different characters in these modes and wear different rings and patches that give you little buffs. So it actually feels really well thought out, and gives you a reason to keep coming back to the game even after you've totally finished the main story.
Son of a bitch!
Hey, keep it together.
I may be completely done with the main story, but I know I'll be jumping into these challenge modes every once in a while for a while. Looking back on how the game initially hit me in 2019, I can't help but just be in awe of how much my opinion has changed. At the end of the day, the biggest crime Days Gone commits is not the wobbly story, the derivative characters, or even the dirty launch. The cardinal sin here is that Days Gone holds too much of its appeal back way too far into the experience. It's front-loaded with too much of its dull characters and tedious grinding, and back-loaded with the better weapons, items, more varied missions, and the majority of the undeniably spectacular horde battles. The hordes, in particular, despite being perhaps the game's greatest achievement, aren't even remotely approachable until many hours into it. Had they spread those elements out a little more evenly, I think it probably would have stuck the landing much better in terms of critical reception. But either way, I'm glad that I was really able to give it that last big shot that I did. Now, recently the conversation about Days Gone is mostly centered around whether or not the game was treated fairly by Sony and whether or not it deserves a sequel. Supposedly somebody higher up, whether that was within Bend or at Sony themselves, has said no to the idea of a sequel, effectively taking Days Gone's potential as a franchise behind the barn and shooting it. And I think I ultimately agree with that. Now, while I certainly wouldn't mind seeing a sequel to Days Gone one day, I would absolutely play it, I think the lessons that Sony Bend has learned from making this one would probably be best applied to a new IP instead of keeping those ideas trapped in this one. Another story in the Days Gone universe would likely still suffer from a lot of the same narrative shortcomings, as it would assumedly still involve these characters, who I just don't really care to see more of. The best way to do a Days Gone sequel to me would probably be with a fresh slate of characters, and at that point, what do you even really have here? You might as well make something new at that point anyway. Also, I just don't agree with the notion that every good game needs a sequel anyway. I understand that Days Gone sales numbers are getting thrown around and compared to other games a lot, but that's not the only thing that matters. And certainly not the only thing that matters to Sony. How a developer's time and resources are best spent, and of course whether or not there's logical room for a whole new story within an IP also matters. One of the best things about PlayStation Studios that I've always liked over the last 20 years is that their developers rarely stick to one franchise for too long before trying something new. God of War with Santa Monica is of course the biggest exception to that, but Guerrilla moved on from Killzone, Naughty Dog moved away from Jak and Daxter, and looks like they're moving away from Uncharted as well. Sucker Punch moved on from Sly Cooper and then also moved on from Infamous. And even though I love all of those IPs and I would gladly play a new game in any of them, I can also see why moving away from them was smart, because it opened the door to something new. The fact that Nintendo and Xbox continue to be largely defined by the same handful of franchises for decades is a weakness for those ecosystems, and it's something that PlayStation has shown more of a willingness to avoid, which is a good thing. Now, I know Days Gone has only had the one game, and the story did sort of end on a cliffhanger of sorts, but personally, I'm fine with leaving it there. Deacon and Sarah's story is wrapped up, Iron Mike's camp was successfully avenged, and if you play through the Ripper storyline, then you know that they got the ass whooping they deserve too. That's not to say any of those threads couldn't be revived for a sequel, but as they are, they feel done to me. Regardless of what Sony Bend does or doesn't do with the IP, nothing can take away what an interesting experience Days Gone ended up being. It recovers from an underwhelming narrative as its gameplay blossoms into some of the best zombie smashing action you'll ever play. It has a full-throated story that might hit or miss depending on your taste, but it's there if you want it. And if you don't, it still has tons of things to discover, locations to be raided, motorcycle parts to be experimented with, and of course thousands upon thousands of relentless freakers, humans, and forest creatures for you to shoot, slice, bludgeon, blow up, and set on fire to your heart's content.
Yep, burn to hell.
The game is a blast to play, and no corporate decision from Sony at this point will ever change that, especially if you have a decent PC or PS5 to play it on. Even though I have my complaints, and I feel strongly about them, I do hope that this review gives you the push you need to at least try it, if you haven't yet. I don't usually tell people to stick with games that they aren't enjoying, but in this case, I highly recommend pushing through its brittle exterior and getting to that creamy center of open-world mayhem that awaits.